Okay, so let's now look at the virtual camera and the real camera, or what we can take from the real camera that we can apply to the virtual camera. So I'll just quickly play a video. This is one of the Axis Studios demo reels, and within it has a range of beautiful camera shots. So in CG we have the ability to create and do pretty much whatever we want. Any camera move we can dream of, we can create. But that doesn't mean we should. And quite often, new artists don't pay enough attention to what the camera is doing. Something that can be incredibly detrimental to the image or the shot. So a general rule of thumb would be, if you can't do it in real life with a real camera, or you've never seen it in a movie, then you probably shouldn't do it. So as I mentioned briefly, your camera is a tool. It's a tool to aid in the telling of the story of the scene. So the most simple explanation of this would be the Zolly, which is a zoom and a dolly at the same time. And it's utilised to invoke a sense of fear or shock. It's kind of like the cinematic version of your stomach falling out of your bottom. And it works to a really great effect. Now, it's worth reading up on as many different camera choices as possible to get a real feel for why and when directors make these decisions. So, we mentioned framing earlier, and I wanted to talk about just some basic choices. We are in no way going to explore all the different camera shots or camera choices, and to be honest, a lot of them wouldn't apply to what we want to do here anyway, but I would definitely recommend just a quick Google can tell you most of what you need to know about why directors choose to set the cameras up in certain ways. But we will talk about some very simple ones just as an explanation. So we did mention framing earlier, and here I wanted to talk about some of the basic choices. So this is a shot from 12 Monkeys, and it shows us the power of a subtle camera choice. So here's a standard shot, and it may look something like this. But just by tilting the camera and making it Dutch, which is just another word for angled, we can create this instability and this otherworldliness. It's very simple but very effective, and it definitely introduces a sense of unease. Now, if we choose to, for instance, shoot down on a subject, then we make them feel insignificant. Or we can shoot up towards a subject, and this definitely adds a sense of power. Removing the bottom of the frame entirely is a great way to introduce a sense of uncertainty. Here it's used on a climber. He's obviously lying on the ground, but we could be a bit more imaginative with it in our own pieces. For our stills though, we're interested in the real camera, or what the real camera does that our virtual camera doesn't. And it sounds a little bit counterproductive to try and reproduce the very thing that photographers fight to remove. But it's these artifacts that add reality to our CG renders. So we'll go through a few of them. We'll look at exposure, lens distortion, bloom and light leak and lens flare, some noise and some grain, motion blur, depth of field, and chromatic aberration. We'll also briefly cover grading, but we'll look at that a bit later. So, exposure. Anyone who has ever had or ever used a camera has had to fight with exposure. Unlike our eyes, cameras aren't that great at balancing all the light that we see at one time, and that's something that we need to be aware of when we are creating our renders and comping our shots. So here is one of my more recent pieces, and when I was building this image, I looked at lots of reference of forest photography. And one of the most obvious, or one of the most clear things that were happening in each image is just that when you're within a forest, obviously you have less light, so you have to expose up, which means that anything bright that's poking through the trees, i.e. the sky, will start to become a little bit overexposed, and that's fine. You don't need to go ahead and try to expose perfectly the whole image. In fact, it's a little bit unnatural to do so, and it adds a sense of reality and realness, I guess, to the image itself. Another example of this might be interior photography. I'll bring up one of my favourite artists. It's a guy called Bertrand Benoit, and he is a architectural photographer, or he used to be an architectural photographer. Now he's a CG artist, and a very, very good one. So if we look at some of his renders, you can see here, the light here is completely blown out at the window. And it makes for a more realistic image, right? Because if we did take this picture with a real camera, this is what would happen. Alternatively, if we were outside and we were looking in, everything inside the windows would become dark. And again, it's a realistic camera choice to introduce this into your image. You don't need to see inside buildings because that just wouldn't happen anyway. So that's exposure. Next we'll look at lens distortion. So lens distortion is caused by the lens being spherical. So when we move towards the edges of the frame, the image itself becomes a little bit distorted. And we can set this up in comp. It's pretty easy to set up in comp, but I would definitely use it sparingly, and I would also try to find a good reference, such as this, for something that you're trying to recreate. It's very easy to overdo it. So bloom, glow, and lens flare is another additional and often used, or should I say are another additional and often overused camera effect, caused by bright parts of the image creating a wash over other parts. And in comp we can set up a threshold so that everything over a certain value creates a glow, and I personally prefer to manually add blooms as a compositional tool. This is a shot from Kiss Me First that we made for Channel 4 in Netflix at Access Studios. And you can see the sun coming in from the left is creating this nice soft orange haze almost at the edge of the frame. Light leak's a little bit different. Light leak is caused by light actually physically getting into the camera and causing artifacts within the shot. This is an example of, in my opinion, a well-used lens flare. This is an environment I created for Axis, and it's very subtle. It's just sitting over the sun. That's really all you need. And I do love lens flare, but they are often an artistic choice that can overwhelm the image and are probably best left for sci-fi pieces, such as this beautiful one from Star Trek. I'm not saying this is unappealing, but you can quickly overwhelm the image just by lens flare, and it's pretty much all you see. So next up is noise. And noise is usually caused by low light levels, and it was a big problem in film before everything went digital. Nowadays, obviously cameras, or the best cameras, have almost no noise, and we can create CG renders with absolutely no noise, and they're absolutely perfect. Noise will add a bit of texture to the image though, and that helps break the CG-ness a little. Even some of the absolute best CG renders still feel and look CG. So any touches of reality that we can add on top of that will help. And noise and grain is just another artistic tool that you can use. All of these should be used carefully though, as they can easily be overdone and will in no way compensate for poor CG or compositional skills. So here is obviously a shot from a very old movie, and they have noise everywhere, of course. But here, First Man by Damien Chazelle, beautiful soundtrack. He has looked at, obviously, films of the time within the 60s and 70s, and he's tried to introduce, and obviously he could have filmed this without any noise, of course he could have, but he chose not to because it's a nice narrative input, and it really gives the film a sense of time. So next up is motion blur. Most people are familiar with motion blur. It doesn't really require too much of an introduction, but we'll cover it briefly. So motion blur occurs when you move the camera or the subject faster than the camera can capture. In the camera, it takes balancing the shutter speed and the aperture, the exposure and the ISO to try and reduce or increase it and make sure that the image is readable. But in CG, we don't have these problems, and we can add motion blur to any render or exposure that we like. It may be worth thinking about how much you would expect in real life though, based on some of these factors, rather than just making it up. But for the most part, no one will notice. So next up is depth of field. So depth of field is another focus tool used to help us make sure that the viewer is paying attention to the right part of the image by blurring part of the image based on the lens shape. Now again, this is connected to another camera setting, the aperture. And the reason I mention this is that to add true realism, it's not as easy as just laying these passes on top. Although most people won't notice, balancing all these settings correctly and as realistically as possible will increase the final look, assuming realism is what you're after. And it also means that they're repeatable, like if you work out how to do this stuff using settings and using real world settings, then it means that you can be consistent throughout your work. Another example here is another image from Kiss Me First. And again, the background is knocked out of focus and we're using an anamorphic lens here, or we're simulating an anamorphic lens to create these elliptical bokehs. Otherwise they would be perfectly circular. So finally, I'll just briefly mention chromatic aberration. And this is caused by imperfections in the lens and the fact that the lens bends and it's elliptical. So the light comes in and near the edges, because of the imperfections, the light starts to separate a little bit and it creates a little bit of separation in the colours and in the colour spectrum near the edges of the frame. Again, this is something that should be used sparingly. It doesn't need to be thrown around the place. A lot of games these days have a lot of chromatic aberration unnecessarily. But again, used tastefully, it can add another layer of realism. So the final thing I wanted to talk about was grading, but again, we'll mention that later because it requires its own video. And that's all for the virtually real camera, which is quite difficult to say. And next we'll look at analysing reference. Thanks.